My name is Cole Holt, and I want to tell you something about cells. A cell is designed to remove your options. That is its entire purpose. 4 walls, a door that opens from the outside, and the complete removal of every variable that might give you something to work with. It is a practical design, and it works extremely well against species that experience confinement as the removal of capability. Humans do not experience confinement that way. We experience it as a change in which capabilities are available. That is a different thing entirely. I had been in the holding facility on Station Vora 6 for 11 days when things changed. Not because anything had been decided about my situation. Nothing had been decided. I had been taken off a supply run through the outer Kareth corridor on suspicion of carrying restricted cargo, which I had not been carrying. And the process of establishing that I had not been carrying it was moving through the Valdorian administrative system at the pace that Valdorian administrative systems moved, which was thorough and slow and entirely indifferent to how long it took. The holding facility was clean and maintained and staffed by people who were professional and neutral, and completely uninterested in me as anything other than a case number on a processing queue. I used the 11 days well. The facility had 14 cells in the wing where I was being held. I knew this because I could hear the occupancy patterns in the ventilation system, which changed subtly, depending on how many cells were occupied and where. By day 3, I had an accurate count. The facility had 2 guards on the night rotation, and 3 on the day rotation. I knew this because footstep patterns in corridors are consistent once you have listened long enough to learn them, and I had been listening since day 1. The facility's power grid had a cycling pattern that I could detect through the lighting in my cell, a slight variation in intensity at irregular intervals that corresponded to load shifts somewhere in the station's main grid. By day 6, I understood the cycle well enough to predict it. The facility's communication system ran through a relay that was housed in the maintenance section 2 corridors from my cell. I knew this because on day 4, a maintenance crew had worked on it for 3 hours, and the sound profile of the work told me what they were working on and approximately where. None of this was useful by itself. Together, it was a complete picture of a facility that I understood better than most of the people who worked in it, built from 11 days of careful listening in a cell with nothing else to do. On day 11, something changed that made the picture useful. The change was not about me, it was about the station. I heard it first in the ventilation system, a shift in the airflow pattern that told me something had changed in the power distribution, followed by a change in the lighting cycle that was different from the standard variation I had been tracking for 6 days. Then, the footstep patterns changed, the 3-day guards moving in a way that was faster and less regular than their standard rotation, which meant something had happened that they were responding to. Then the emergency alarm sounded. Not a full evacuation alarm. A localized alert, the kind that stations used for contained incidents that required response, but not station-wide action. The sound profile told me it was coming from the administrative section of the facility, which was the section I could not see but could hear through the ventilation, with reasonable clarity. I listened. What I heard over the next 4 minutes told me 3 things. The first was that the facility's administrative system had experienced a critical software fault that had locked the processing queue and the case management system and the communication relay simultaneously. Simultaneously, how does a case management system and the communication relays, which was the kind of cascading failure that happened when a patch was applied incorrectly to an integrated system. The second was that the fault had locked every case file in the system, including mine, which meant the administrative processing that had been slowly moving my situation toward resolution had stopped completely. The third was that the fault had also locked the facility's external communication system, which meant the staff could not call for technical support from the station's main systems team. I listened to the guards and the administrative staff trying to manage this for 20 minutes. Then I knocked on my cell door. The day guard, a Valdorian named Voss, who had been professionally neutral toward me for 11 days, opened the observation panel and looked at me with the expression of someone who was managing a crisis and did not have time for additional complications. I said I might be able to help. He said with what? I said the software fault, the cascading lock in the integrated administrative system. The patch was applied incorrectly to the case management module, and it propagated to the communication relay through the shared authentication layer. The fix is straightforward, but it requires manual access to the system core, which is in the maintenance section 2 corridors from here. He stared at me. I said I worked communications and systems maintenance for 7 years before I started running cargo. I have seen this specific fault type twice before. I can fix it in under an hour. He continued staring at me. I said you cannot call for technical support because the communication relay is locked. Your administrative staff cannot fix it because it requires maintenance level occurred. You have a maintenance section 2 corridors away, and you have me. He said, how do you know about the maintenance section? I said, I've been listening to your facility for 11 days. I know where everything is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the cell door. He walked with me to the maintenance section with his hand near his weapon, which was reasonable, and I did not say anything about that because it was reasonable. And I did not say anything about that because it was reasonable. The maintenance section was exactly where I had calculated it would be, and the system core was accessible through a standard panel, and the fault was exactly what I had diagnosed from 11 days away through a ventilation system. I fixed it in 43 minutes, not because I was rushing, because it was not a complicated fault once you were looking at it directly. The patch had overwritten a shared authentication parameter that 3 modules used simultaneously, and the fix was to restore the original parameter value and reapply the patch in the correct sequence. The communication relay came back online first, then the case management system, then the processing queue. Boss stood behind me and watched the system restore, and said nothing until the screens were showing green. Then he said, "How did you know it was the authentication parameter?" I said the fault pattern. When 3 integrated modules lock simultaneously, and the timing is right after a patch application, the shared layer is almost always the point of failure. The authentication parameter is the most commonly overwritten shared value in systems of this architecture because it sits at the intersection of all 3 modules, and patch documentation often fails to flag it. He said, you diagnosed this from a cell through the ventilation system. I said I had time to think. He was quiet for a moment. He said 11 days. I said yes. He said, you spent 11 days listening to the facility. I said there was not much else to do. He said most detainees spend their time trying to communicate with their contacts or filing requests or demanding status updates on their processing. I said those all seemed less useful than understanding the situation I was in. He held my gaze with the steady look of someone who was revising something. He said, your case file is now accessible. I said yes. He said the processing queue has resumed. I said yes. He said your cargo manifest verification should complete within the standard timeline from this point. I said I understood. He walked me back to my cell, and I went in and he closed the door, and I sat down on the bunk. 20 minutes later, the observation panel opened. He said the facility administrator wanted to speak with me. I said, of course. The facility administrator was a Valdorian named Keth, senior and precise. A Valdorian named Keth, senior and precise, who met me in the interview room with 2 staff members and the data tablet and the particular expression of someone who had just had their afternoon restructured by a detainee in a way they had not anticipated. She said, you fixed the system fault. I said, yes. She said, you diagnosed it from a holding cell through the ventilation system. I said I had time and the sound gave me enough information to build a reasonable picture. She said, you knew where the maintenance section was. I said, yes. She said, you have been here 11 days. I said, yes. She looked at her tablet. She said, your cargo manifest verification has been completed. The restricted cargo concern has been completed. The restricted cargo concern has been resolved. Your vessel has been cleared for release. She paused. She said, your case was actually resolved 3 days ago, but the notification had been delayed in the processing queue due to a backlog. I looked at her. She said, you have been eligible for release for 3 days. I said I did not know that. She said the queue was backed up. I said I understand. She said you spent those 3 days listening to the facility through the ventilation system and diagnosing a software fault and fixing it. I said I did not know I was going to need to fix anything when I started listening. She said, why were you listening? I said because understanding the situation I'm in is more useful than not understanding it. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the data tablet. She said the facility's integrated system has been experiencing intermittent instability for 6 weeks. 3 technical teams have been unable to identify the root cause. Your repair this afternoon resolved the immediate fault, but your documentation of the authentication parameter issue is the first accurate root cause identification we have had. She said, our systems team has been working from the wrong starting point for 6 weeks. I said the authentication parameter is easy to miss because it does not appear in the fault logs directly. You have to infer it from the pattern of what locks simultaneously. She said you inferred it from 11 days of listening to ventilation patterns and lighting cycles. I said in footstep patterns. The guard rotation told me a lot about when things were normal and when they were not. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said something I had not expected. She said the facility had a recurring problem with its power cycling that the maintenance team had been unable to diagnose for 4 months. She said she did not suppose I had any observations about that. I looked at her. I said the load shift pattern in the cycling suggested an impedance mismatch in the junction between the primary and secondary grid feeds in the outer ring. The variation frequency pointed to the junction between sections 7 and 9, based on the timing relative to the standard station maintenance cycle. She stared at me. I said I could be wrong. I was working from lighting variations in a holding cell. But that would be my starting point if I were looking for it. She said, you have been in a holding cell for 11 days. I said yes. She said, and you identified a power cycling fault that our maintenance team has been unable to diagnose for 4 months. I said I had a lot of time to listen. She closed her data tablet. She said your vessel clearance is being processed now. You will be released within the hour. She paused. She said the power cycling observation. I would like you to put it in writing before you leave. I said of course. She said the maintenance team lead will want to speak with you if you are willing. I said I have time. She looked at me one more time with the expression of someone whose afternoon had gone in a direction she had not planned for and who was deciding how to feel about that. She said Cole Holt. I said yes. She said 11 days. I said yes. She said most people in that cell spend 11 days waiting. I said waiting seemed less useful than listening. She said, apparently. She stood and gathered her tablet and stopped at the door. She said the holding facility's integrated system has been more stable this afternoon than it has been in 6 weeks. I said I am glad the fix held. She said so are we. She left. I wrote up the power cycling observation and spoke with the maintenance team lead for 40 minutes and was released 2 hours later with my vessel cleared and my cargo manifest confirmed and the particular feeling of a person who has been somewhere inconvenient for 11 days and is finally going somewhere else. Voss processed my release at the front desk. He handed me my documentation and looked at me one last time. He said I have worked in this facility for 9 years. I said, yes. He said I have processed a great many detainees. I said I imagine so. He said none of them have ever left Haven. G fixed more of our problems than we fixed of theirs. I said I just had time to listen and something to offer when the moment came. He said most people with time to listen use it differently. I said, I know. He said safe travels, Cole Holt. I said safe travels. I walked out of the facility into the station concourse and found my ship in the docking bay where she had been waiting for 11 days, and I ran a full systems check and filed my departure clearance and set a course back to the outer Kareth corridor. Behind me, Station Vora's 6 ran its systems in the particular way that stations run when someone has just fixed the thing that had been wrong for 6 weeks. I thought about cells and what they removed and what they did not, and the 11 days I had spent learning a facility that had needed learning. Then I thought about the next run, and the delivery schedule, and the port thruster that always needed looking at. Some things did not change regardless of where you had spent the last 11 days. I set my course, and started flying.